Hello, and welcome to the Everyday Business Problems Podcast. I'm your host, Dave Chrysler. Each episode, we talk to business owners and leaders to learn about their story, their business, the challenges they've overcome, and the challenges they still face. You'll hear fresh insights, real talk, and get inspiration to grow your business. Hey, everybody. So excited today to welcome Angela Thurman. Angela is a certified project management professional and owner of Thurman Company, which is a management consulting company located in Houston, Texas. Angela, thank you so much for joining us on the Everyday Business Problems podcast today.
Thank you, David. I'm very happy to be here.
Yeah, I'm really excited to get into this conversation with you because you have such a diverse background and a background in some areas that I've not done a lot of work in. So I'm excited to get into this with you today, talking about project management, supplier risk. So let's dive into it. If you could just tell the listeners a little bit about your background and then how that kind of, what is project management really from a high level?
I'd be happy to. So I am an electrical engineer by training. So I have a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering. I have a master's degree in telecommunications management. As you mentioned, I'm a certified project management professional, which is globally the most recognized project management certification, and that comes from the Project Management Institute, which is a global organization that was founded in 1969. And that organization provides training and a set of standards for project management. In fact, it publishes the project management body of knowledge, and that is a group of guidelines or standards actually for project management as a whole. And this allows a person who wants to be a project manager to have a set of references for what they should be doing to effectively manage their projects. So I've been a member of the PMI since about 2010 and have been a PMP since 2010. However, I've been a project manager much longer than that. In fact, I received my initial project management training when I was an engineer at NASA Lewis, which is now NASA Glenn in Cleveland, Ohio. At that time, I was working for helping to develop the power systems for the space station, and I managed the suppliers that helped to develop those systems. So I was managing the budget, the schedule, the requirements for the power systems, particularly the load converters on the space station. And I was very lucky to be able to be trained by Dr. Harold Kersner, who was an instructor, a professor at a local university. And Dr. Kersner is recognized globally as one of the founders of modern project management theory. So NASA would bring Dr. Kersner in to teach project management to all of the engineers. And so I was instructed by him very early in my career.
That is just so cool.
Yes.
Some of that I did not know, so I really appreciate you sharing that. It's just so cool to hear some of your experience and what you've done. Obviously you and I have, built a relationship over the course of time being on some different panels and things together, but Yeah, just so fun to understand the wide range of experience that you have with your background. What would you say, are some of the major challenges that you see most often when it comes to project management? I mean, you've been a part of some really complex projects, and
Mhm.
obviously, the more complex, the more potential challenges there are. But what are some of the things that you see from a recurring standpoint on maybe some simpler projects and on some of those really complex things that you've been a part of?
Mhm. Well, something ki something just as simple as, it's the, duty of the project manager to validate the requirements, and so, um, several years ago, I was on a telecommunications project, and, um, so, the attorneys had gotten the contracts completed, and everyone had signed off on the contracts, and that was all well and good, and then the requirements had flowed down to me, who at that time, I was a project engineer, was my title, but my role was actually, project manager, and the requirements flowed down to me, and, um and it's like, "Oh, well, this is not gonna work," because the way the contracts were written, um, from the customer side of the contract, it said the meet point for this fiber optic connection is going to be the manhole in the street. And the supplier side of the contract, which is what my role was, said the meet point for this connection is the back of our equipment on the ninth floor of this building. And I'm like, did nobody realize that those two things are not the same? And so it was, while the contract was perfectly legal, it was not technically feasible. And so we had an issue. And by the way, that's kind of how I got interested in contracts. And that kind of launched that part of my interest in and my career.
Got it. So, in a situation like that, I mean, what's kind of the next step? I mean, it's interesting because I did not realize as again, and maybe this was just happened to be part of that particular role and that particular scope, but I guess from my standpoint, I didn't realize some of the intricacies that you end up highlighting because of your project management experience and knowing, right, when you read these two things, hey, we've got a problem here. So, what does the next step look like in terms of being able to resolve that? Because again, being responsible for bringing this project home, that's obviously a major component of it. We've got to make sure that both sides are not only communicating, but match up so that you can deliver, what the expectation is for that particular project.
Well, in that particular case, it was this particular location was in Chicago, and our schedule. So obviously, work stopped, and um, the city of Chicago had a moratorium that you could not um, disrupt the streets between the beginning of November and the end of January. So we couldn't um, go in and dig up the street to pull new fiber out of that manhole into the building. So our schedule was delayed. There were the additional costs to pull new fiber. Um, so there went the schedule, there went the budget. And so as a project manager, I'm going, oh no, oh no. And and you obviously had to amend the contracts.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was an interesting case. So,
Yeah.
but eventually, of course, you do get all those things resolved. And you have to go back to your stakeholders and, first of all, create a risk advisory to say, we've got, an issue. This is not just a risk. This is an issue. And then get everyone involved, start the process to get the contracts amended, work on the schedule, because you got to, in that particular case, we had the moratorium. How are we going to work around that, or do the work after the moratorium is lifted? And then re-baseline our schedule, go to our sponsor for additional funding, for more contractors to come, and more equipment, and everything we need to pull new fiber, and all of that. So that was that. It seemed like such a little thing, but
Right.
it turned out to be a big thing.
Yeah, I can imagine. I mean, that's a great example. And what you said in there in terms of, that risk assessment component of this, I'd like to talk about that a little bit, because I would imagine that, first off, I would imagine that you have many, many stories like that. But that story alone, I would imagine, was enough to prompt you and teach you about going through this process from a project management standpoint, and the things to be looking out for. And how does risk then kind of enter that picture? So what are some of the risks, both on, I would say the supplier side, as well as just in general, like some of these misalignments, if you will, between what the expectation is, or what the two parties are? How do you go through and assess some of that? What are the things that you're looking for from that kind of risk perspective to make sure that you don't have another situation like that unfold, or if you do, that it's obviously, somewhat mitigated?
Mhm. So, so because of that occurrence, and a couple of other things, at that time, the vice president of engineering for that company pulled me out of the role that I was in, and set me to reviewing every contract that came across his desk from a technical perspective. So I was not, looking for legalese. I was looking at the technical feasibility of every contract that came across his desk. And eventually, I led a group of 9 paralegals for that specific purpose. And that was a great opportunity for me. And that was exactly what we did. So we looked for things like schedule risk. And if our organization is working on these projects and some other opportunity comes in, what is the return on investment of not being able to work on that opportunity? Or if we deploy teams for that new opportunity, what might be the impact of incurring penalties on our current projects if they don't meet the schedule? So a lot of that was the kind of work that I did at that time.
Very cool. And
Yeah,
how many in general would you say, I know these are large companies that you were working for at the time.
that
How
was,
many
yeah.
projects would you be typically evaluating and handling to be able to kind of have that risk assessment in terms of, like you said, opportunity cost, right? Or some penalty clauses. So we want to push this back. What was that general number? Was it just a handful? Was it hundreds of projects? What was
Well,
it?
well, in the course of less than a year, it went from just me reviewing contracts to me and a team of 9 paralegals.
Wow.
So it grew. I mean, and at one point in telecommunications, you a very common product or service that is offered is called co-location. So you build out a space and you have you have not only your telecommunication services, but power and so forth. And your customers will be co-located in your space to take advantage of that. And usually in exchange for that co-located space and the provision of power and maintenance and that sort of thing, there will be a certain amount of traffic that they will put on your network. So there's the expectation that they'll be using your services, your telecommunication network, in exchange for that space and power. And that's always written into the contract. And it's usually some sort of minimum. So a minimum amount of traffic each month. Well, we discovered that while that minimum was written into the contract, most, if not almost all, of these customers were not meeting their minimum billing requirements. But no one had notified accounting that there was this minimum. And so they were just being billed their actual usage. And this had been going on for years.
Wow.
And so it wouldn't have been very nice to go and just suddenly start hitting this customer. Let's say that they were actually using $100 worth of service and the minimum was $2,000 a month. Well, to just suddenly drop a bill from $100 to $2,000, or to back bill them 2 years, which is a typical number, to say, oh, you know what, we forgot to bill you for the last 2 years at $2,000 a month. So here you go. That wouldn't have been very nice. So what we did was account for all of that and provide our leadership and accounting and, you know, all the revenue teams this summary statement and say, here's the money that's been left on the table for the last 2 years. And we recommend notifying everyone that says, you know, all these customers, to say, here's what you've not been billed, and going forward, we will begin to bill you the actual contract rate. So
Yeah.
we were greatly appreciated, I'll just say.
Yeah, that kind of reminds me, you know, when I was in my corporate life, I worked for a company that grew through acquisition, and as we would acquire these facilities, you know, we would bring them onto our ERP, and it was a standard costing business that that we would implement in these acquisition facilities, and oftentimes, the further you got into the standard costing and started to, you know, get some data back in terms of where particular customers landed as far as profitability, you would see the leadership's eyes kind of just jump out of their head, because it's like, wait a second, we've been doing it for how much, and we've been losing how much money? And, you know,
Yes.
they would want that immediate, you know, kind of, hey, we need to go back and ramp this up. It's like, well, wait a second, you know, yesterday you had no idea where this is where you were at. So, you know, we need to start working towards obviously where we need to be. But, you know, that was a story that, you know, you kind of reminded me of with your example, because I think that happens more often than people would like. And it's, you know, somebody with your skill set that can not only do the project management part, but it's all of the additional digging into, if you will, that is really where the value comes in at. So, Angela, can you talk a little bit about some of the maybe more recent projects that you've gotten into? Because I know you've been doing some different project management and helping businesses, you know, implement systems and things like that. So maybe could you share with us just a little bit about a couple of the latest projects that you've got going on?
Um, I can, in a limited sense, yes.
Sure, sure.
So, so recently worked for a software company that needed to revamp their educational platform. So as you're aware, a lot of software companies or companies that manufacture equipment, for example. So let's say that you have routers or some sort of technology-based equipment. On your website, you'll have training material, or you'll have a program to train the people who want, and I'll just use Cisco for an example. They'll have a training program, and you can become a Cisco certified professional, and a lot of this training is available for free, and that's very common in the industry. Now, the certification itself is not free; just the training material is free, and having that certification has a certain value. It gives credence to, just like the PMP has value. Sure. To me. It shows evidence that you have the skill set, and it's something nice to have on your resume and whatnot. So this particular software company asked me to come in and serve as the project manager as they begin to refresh their training program. Their not so much for their commercial customers, but for their university programs, and for individuals who would want to take their training outside of a commercial situation.
Got it.
So that was really, really interesting. I got a lot out of it. I hope they got a lot out of it as well. And it gave me the opportunity to work in an industry different than what I typically serve. And I learned a lot of new things. But because project management, the skills are highly transferable, that I think that was very effective.
Yeah, I mean, from my standpoint, it feels as though project management is, similar to business consulting, right? It's for the most part, and there's some intricacies depending on how deep you get into specific verticals, but for the most part, it's industry and business agnostic, right? The
Yes.
advice is typically the same. It's just a matter of how deep you're going with it and if the people are ready to receive it. And I would imagine in this most recent example that they got quite a bit out of what you were able to provide, because if you just think about the amount of work to coordinate and kind of land that plane, with the different modules, I would imagine. So you've got, your subject matter, you've got your modules, you've probably got some, practice tests and things like that, or quizzes along the way. And it's just it's a lot of things going on all at once that needs some scheduling around it, needs somebody to own it and make sure that these different projects are, sub projects or tasks are landing in the place that they should be. So I appreciate you sharing that. It kind of is a great entry into my next question, which is, at what point should a business consider bringing in somebody like yourself versus trying to handle it internally or with a, champion somehow, some way? At what point does it make sense to bring somebody in with your skill set?
That's a really good question. And so my business, my firm, we are focused on those small to medium-sized companies that likely do not have an in-house expert. And so we want them to realize that you can bring in a project manager, and because we're used to working on projects, which are a time-bound event. We recognize that these are going to have a start and a finish date, and we're not expecting to be around forever. In fact, we don't want to be around forever. That's why we're consultants. And um, and a lot of companies they'll assign, this project to someone in-house who really, bless their heart, they're trying, but they don't have the skills for this, or they're already working so hard on the tasks that are really their job that this is just not something they have the bandwidth to take on. And it is more efficient to bring on someone who does have the skills and can get in there, get it done, and get out. And I just hope that people will hear that message. So the time to bring in a consultant is as soon as possible. As soon as you realize we've got a project, we've got something we want done, and we know that we need it done by a particular date, and we've got the resources, we've got some funding, we've got a sponsor who's ready to champion this, then bring in a project manager to help you see it through. I just think that is the way to go. And I'm hoping that more and more companies will begin to see that. Just like you would bring in a business consultant or any other type of expert, bring in a project management expert. Unless you're willing to begin to invest in a project management office, and begin to hire people to do that, a consultant really is the best way to go.
Yeah. I think for a lot of business owners and, business leadership teams, I think the challenge is not understanding what the real opportunity cost of trying to handle some of these projects internally,
Mhm.
right? You mentioned about not having the skill set. I mean, let's just talk about the tools, right? You've got a particular set of, tools and software and the skill set on top of that. So even if a company wants to go ahead and invest in, let's say, the tools, you've still got opportunity costs to be considered, because whoever is going to be now learning this new software and these new tools, that's more time away from what their sole responsibility is.
Mhm.
And it gets back to a lot of times what I say to business owners is that you can't be great at every single thing, and you can't expect everybody to do everything. Right.
Right.
So just like you
Right.
as a business owner may not love accounting, and so you bring in a CPA or a bookkeeper or what have you, it's the same type of thing. So you have to evaluate those opportunity costs. And I think that is what is really missing in terms of people seeking out somebody like yourself, because they're not looking at it from the big picture. It's kind of very, well, this is right, what's right in front of me. We've got this project, some so and so can handle it because they've got a couple of hours in their day. So that would be my advice, to make sure that as a leadership team, as a business owner, that you are really stepping back and evaluating the full opportunity cost
Mhm.
and comparing that to somebody who is an expert at project management, that has the tools, that has the skill set, that can get in, get out, manage the project, bring it in on time and hopefully under budget, and, be able to execute against that. So I appreciate you sharing that with us. So do you have any, kind of final thoughts to share, Angela, in terms of what people should be looking out for as these projects are coming their way, as it relates to, again, bringing somebody in like yourself? What are some thoughts that you would share with somebody that's, maybe early stages and or late stages of
Mhm.
understanding what this is all about and what they need to do moving forward?
I think that, yeah, I do. There are a few things. So just because you purchase Microsoft Project and you throw it at someone does not make them a project manager. That is a wonderful tool. I love Microsoft Project, but I've been using it for, 20 plus years. And an another thing is that a a a a real grown-up project manager is going to bring a deep understanding of things like dependencies and risk that are the things that are going to really hold you up, and to be able to identify those early and mitigate risk is where the value of a project manager can really be seen. I have a perfect example of this. So this spring, I had to have some work done in my home, and every time I talked to the contractor, it was like, "Yeah, we'll have that done next week. We'll have that done next week." And I finally got so fed up, I just called a meeting. I had the owner of the company and the foreman walk through the project with me. And I'm like, okay, so what needs to be done? And how long is that going to take? And we went through every task. And I built a Microsoft project schedule. And I showed him that because of the dependencies, you can't paint the cabinets until they're built. And you can't put the granite countertops on the cabinets until the paint has dried, and it's going to be 3 days for the paint to dry. All of these things. His very optimistic schedule simply could not hold. And here's what the realistic schedule was. And here was what the could actually take this long schedule was. And when I laid it out for him in black and white, he didn't like it, but he accepted it. And I think that it takes that kind of granularity for um, some people to be able to see the value of the project, and you really do need that mentality, that project management mentality, um, to lead the team to a successful conclusion.
Yeah, I really love that example because it's number one, it's so easy for people to understand. And number two, it really does illustrate the value that somebody that has a deep understanding and experience with this, where you can take something, I don't want to say as mundane as construction, right? Because there's nothing really mundane about it, but people take it for granted. You hear a lot of those similar stories in terms of, oh, we can get to that next week. And whether that's the project being wrapped up or the project starting. And you hear
Mhm,
that time and time again from the end users, right? And as
mhm.
construction companies go, that is very prevalent where there's a lot of over promising and under delivering. And a lot of that is exactly what you said, not understanding the dependencies and the intricacies of all of the steps that are involved. And
Mhm.
obviously, that is a very, simple example that you gave. And the more complex the industry, the more complex the project, obviously that just continues to be exponentially, deeper longer schedules, more suppliers to evaluate, more contracts to evaluate. So I really appreciate you sharing that. And I think it does do a nice job of laying out for people not only why it's important to take a look at these things, but even for something as simple as what somebody may say would be very straightforward scheduling, you could still utilize somebody with your skill set and the tools, because again, just purchasing the tools doesn't necessarily give you all of the additional experience that, many years of experience that you learn these different ins and outs and dependencies and risk assessment. So Angela, I really appreciate you coming on the podcast today and sharing all of this information as it relates to project management and supplier risk. If people want to learn more about you and connect with you, where's the best place for them to find you?
My website is thurmanco.com, or they can always connect with me on LinkedIn.
Awesome. And I will make sure to add those links into the show notes for everybody. Angela, thanks again for coming on the Everyday Business Problems podcast. It's been a pleasure, and I really appreciate you taking the time.
Oh, thank you, David.
Thank you so much for listening today. If we brought you any value, please rate, subscribe, and share our podcast. Also, be sure to connect with us on social media by searching @The Chrysler Club. Until next week, I'm your host, Dave Chrysler.